Okay, we're gonna start and we're gonna be talking about interpretation, types, and modes. So I want to be clear on this before we start that the classification of interpretation types between types and modes, sometimes some authors do it in a different way. So we're gonna study here, we're gonna learn here one classification made. However, it doesn't mean that it is written in stone, right? So there are other authors who may classify it in a different way. So I want to be clear on this before we start. So before we start, we're gonna check a definition of interpret. This is something that probably we have clear, but I really liked the way in which this author defines interpret. So let's read it together. It says, interpret is regarded here as translational activity, as a special form of translation. Interpret is an ancient human practice which clearly predates the invention of writing and written translation, of course. So it predates. Let me just read it again. Interpret is regarded here as a translational activity, as a special form of translation. Interpret is an ancient human practice which clearly predates the invention of writing and, of course, written translation. This is not something that we usually analyze or think about, but interpretation came before translation, okay? And why is that? Well, basically, if we go back in human history, humankind first developed a communication code that was oral, spoken language, okay? So that was the first communication mean that we developed. But of course, before we had signs or, but the first formal code was spoken, and it came before the written code. With years, probably thousands of years later, humankind developed a written code. And it was first with pictures or images, symbols, until we got to the symbols that we have nowadays. That interpretation, it clearly predates written language and, of course, translation. So interpretation happened before translation, right? Now let's continue reading. Within the conceptual structure of translation, interpret can be distinguished from other types of translational activity mainly by its immediacy. In principle, interpreting is performed here and now. And that's a very powerful phrase to remember, right? Interpret is performed here and now for the benefit of people who want to engage in communication across barriers of language and culture. So, once I heard, let me share this a little quick. Once I heard saying that translation, no, I didn't hear this. I read this, and it said that translation will stay there for years, decades, centuries maybe. However, interpretation is something that will be produced here and it will disappear here. So it happens and it disappears as it happens, right? In the moment that we're producing it, it is disappearing. Of course, nowadays with recordings and all that, it can be recorded and it will stay there longer, like this video, for example. However, That's something important to remember, right? Translation is something that's gonna stay there for years. And interpretation is something that will be produced here and then it will disappear here. Unless it is recorded, of course. But the purpose of this is, of course, for the benefit of people who want to engage in communication and go beyond the barriers that are created because of language mostly, and of course, because of culture sometimes create some barriers. Now, let's continue here, and we're gonna be checking the types and modes. This classification, as I mentioned at the beginning, is something that is considered by some authors, but others may classify it in a different way. But I really like the way this is divided. So we're gonna be checking this classification. First, we have types, and then we have modes. So we have the types of interpretation that we have is simultaneous interpretation, consecutive, whispered, relay, liaison, and sight. When we talk, and if we read at the bottom, it says types are the techniques used while interpreting. Now, what are the techniques when interpreting? Well, basically, it's the approach that I, as interpreter, will use to execute an interpretation. And it will be defined according to the situation in which we are. It could be up in the client's request. It can be up to my decision as interpreter, considering the elements and tools that we have available. It can also be the setting, the place where we are. It's also related, and it will influence the type of interpretation that I will be using. Also, the client. It won't be the same interpreting for one person than interpreting for 3 people or 300 people, right? So that will also influence the decisions that I as interpreter will make. So we're gonna try to define a little quick each one of this. The first one that we have here is simultaneous. Well, simultaneous is, as a matter of fact, the main reason why most of us are here, right? Simultaneous interpretation is something that's going to happen using equipment, interpretation equipment, right? Simultaneous interpretation will happen, or the interpreter will be in a booth. For those of you who don't know what a booth is, we're going to be defining that probably in the future video. But it's basically a small room for interpreters. If you were able to watch the movie The Interpreter with Nicole Kidman, probably you know what I'm talking about. In that case, in the movie, there are small rooms, right, where the interpreters from different languages are working. So simultaneous interpretation will happen basically almost at the same time as the original message of the speaker. So when the speaker starts the message, probably a couple of sentences later, the interpreter starts delivering the message in the target language, right? So it's simultaneous, as the meaning that the word carries is that it happens at the same time than another action. And of course, the speaker and the interpreter will be speaking at the same time. Of course, the interpreter will be a couple of seconds behind, but the interpreter will be very close to the original message. And as I said before, they'll be speaking at the same time. Now, with consecutive interpretation, the difference is that the speaker will deliver a portion of the message. Oh, it could be one sentence, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences, 10 sentences maybe, or even more. With consecutive, the speaker could have to deliver the complete message, which could be 10 minutes, 5 minutes. The interpreter, of course, has to be taking notes. And this is very important to clarify, that the notes that the interpreters are taking, that's not a transcription. It's not word by word. They're just taking main ideas. They are not using complete words, maybe. They are using symbols. They are using small pictures, acronyms, abbreviations, contractions. And it's going to be a whole technique. The note taking is a whole technique that it has to be developed by each interpreter. But consecutive, again, will be speaker renders a portion or the complete message, then he stops, and then the interpreter comes into a scene and delivers the message in the target language. And it goes like that, okay? Original message, pause, interpretation. And it goes over and over and over again. Unless the speaker delivers the complete message at once, that was 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and the speaker developed that complete message at once while the interpreter was taking notes. In that case, the speaker finishes the message, and then it's the opportunity for the interpreter to render the message using the notes. So then whispered interpretation. Whispered is basically simultaneous interpretation with no equipment, okay? So as the word said, whispered is, it's a whisper when you use a very low volume of your voice, right? And in Spanish is called interpretación susurrada. And it's not that it is really whispered. It's not that I'm gonna be doing it like this. No, not really. That's not the way we actually do it. Basically, in this case, we're gonna be working with 1, 2, 3, no more than 5 people, okay, as clients. We're gonna be located in a specific place in the auditorium, ideally in an area where we cannot get too much interference, or that we do not interfere others. Why? Because probably, let's put this example. The conference is taking place in English, and the great majority of the audience understands English. Just a small group of the audience that doesn't understand English, so they need an interpreter. So let's say that it's 3 people. We're gonna be sitting on the side of the room. Again, this is ideally, but not necessarily the rule. We sit there. I, as interpreter, will sit very close to the clients, and I'll be getting the message. I, as interpreter, I will not have a headset, anything. I'll be getting the audio or the information directly from the sound equipment, from the speakers. The natural source, in case they are using microphone, I'll get it from the speakers. If they're not using a mic, I'll get it directly from the voice, the mouth of the speaker, and I'll be delivering the message simultaneously in the target language to my clients. Again, I need to be close to them because I'm going to be trying to use moderate volume to prevent interfere to the other members of the audience, and that's the way it is executed. In the case of relay is a very interesting one. Sometimes it's difficult to understand it. I usually use pictures in a whiteboard to describe it. But basically, imagine that the conference is taking place in Japanese, and we have people who speak English, Spanish, and Portuguese. and of course other people who are speaking or who speaks Japanese. The conference is taking place in Japanese. However, interpreters, there is only one interpreter who is working Japanese, okay? So he can go from Japanese into English. The interpreter of Spanish doesn't work with Japanese. The interpreter for Portuguese either. And the only one is the interpreter who's doing Japanese English. So basically what we will do is that we will make a chain, basically. The interpreter of English, Japanese English, will get the message from Japanese, will interpret into English to the audience who speaks English or needs the message in English, but also for the other interpreters. So the other interpreters, for example, the one in Spanish, will take the message from the interpretation of English. They'll take the message in English and they will send the message into Spanish, and also the one of Portuguese. So we call that interpreter of Japanese English, we call it the pivot, okay? Because the other interpreters are actually getting the interpretation from him, not directly from the speaker, but from one of the interpreter who is the pivot, and he's taking the message from Japanese, sending it to English, and the others are taking the message in English, from English. And in that way, they're able to send it to Portuguese and Spanish. So that's basically relay interpret. Then we have liaison. Liaison is the type of interpretation, usually bilateral interpretation, meaning that I have to be going from in this case from English into Spanish and for Spanish into English, like interpreting a conversation, going both ways. Because liaison is when I go with my client, if the client has a meeting at X company, I go with him, I help with the communication there. I'll be the bridge of communication. If the person has a conference, I'll go with him to the conference. I go everywhere to all the events that he will be participating in. And then we have sight interpretation, which is basically a mix between translation and interpretation, right? With sight interpretation, basically I have the source language in text, but my target language will be oral, right? So I get a document and they ask me, I want you to read what the document says for me. And then I get the document, I start reading it out loud in Spanish, for example, in case the document was in English. And again, those are the types, okay? Types are the techniques that we will use when interpreting. On the other hand, we have the modes of interpretation. We are going to be taking the modes as conference, judicial, court, public sector, medical, sign language, media. It's very important to highlight that modes here, they are defined as the setting where the interpretation takes place, okay? No matter what technique we use, we will have a specific mode of interpretation here. For example, we can have conference interpretation. Where is that more likely to happen? Well, at a conference, auditorium, so it's a conference. So that's conference interpretation. What type of interpretation can I use? Well, the one that is the best option could be simultaneous, consecutive, whispered, relay. But the important thing here is that it's happening in a conference. Then we have judicial. What is this mode of interpretation happening? Well, it will be probably at a lawyer's office, at a court, or something associated to law, right? What type of interpretation we'll use in this case? Well, I don't know, in my personal case, I've used consecutive, and I have also used whispered interpret in this mode and judicial. Then we have escort. This is related basically with liaison. Why? Because basically it's when you're going with a person. The person goes to a dinner he was invited to by someone, so you go with him, and if this person goes to the city hall to meet the mayor of the city, then I go there, and so on. So it's closely related with liaison. Where will it take place? Where your client is. Where he goes, you go. Then we have the public sector. Obviously, public sector is going to happen with the government, right? So that will be something happening with the president, minister of something, I don't know, but it will be the public sector. Then we have medical interpretation. This is more likely to be happening at a hospital or in a clinic, or also we have here in El Salvador, for example, in my country, we have a lot of people coming from the United States in medical campaigns or medical brigades. So they go to different areas, usually in the countryside, and they have an improvised clinic where they provide health service, usually for free, to the people living in the area. So in that case, it will be, of course, medical interpretation, and I'll be using probably whispered, consecutive, simultaneous if I use portable interpretation equipment, which is something that is being used nowadays as well. Then we have sign language, right? Sign language is, well, we've seen this in TV. Like if you check on your screen, there's a small window in the corner where there is someone rendering the message into sign language. That's also interpretation. And then we have media interpreting. That will take place, of course, at a radio station, like a TV set, like, well, nowadays with YouTubers and TikTokers, probably that's something that could happen anywhere, right? As long as you're in front of a camera and that's being broadcasted, that could be media interpretation. Well, so remember that in this case we're considering modes as the setting where the interpretation takes place, right? If you have questions, you can let me know in the forum or as a comment, and I'll be happy to respond there, okay?